All right, good morning to everyone. I'm glad everybody made it out on this nice little chilly morning today. And Linda, are you going to have a prayer today?
Sharon has written it out and she gave it
to you. That was sweet. Okay. So if you will, I brought the treats today. And
thank you.
You're welcome. So if you will bow with me. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for this time that we have to come together and fellowship with these women and learn from you. Be with Deanna as she leads us today. Be with Sharon and Chris as they go and deal with the difficulty she's having right now. Bring them peace and bring them helpful people. In your son's name, amen.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, I am going to leave this little chat screen up here. So if people write something in the chat, especially we have some certain people like to use the chat and then I miss it because I'm doing too many things. So if there are things that show up in the chat, y'all can tell me and then we will talk about them. Okay. Welcome back to our series At the Table with Jesus. We are in lesson 9, the table ministry in the Gospel of Luke. Lesson 9 is on the road to Emmaus. So we'll be traveling with 2 of Jesus's disciples today and then at the table with them in their home. But before we dive into today's lesson, let's review our previous lesson in which Jesus was eating the Passover meal with his apostles. Okay, what stood out to you about that lesson? What do you remember?
I think that shows us how a good leader leads.
Okay, that's interesting. Linda says that shows us how a good leader leads. Go ahead and say more about that.
Because he is a leader, but he shows service constantly. He's serving others. And a good leader who has a heart to serve others is following Jesus' example.
Yes, and in that he taught about service. That was part of his discipleship lesson in the meal. Yeah, what else? Chris?
His disciples were still having trouble getting it.
There was an argument over who was the greatest even at this final meal, right? Because why was that? How did that go together?
He had been talking about being a servant.
He talked about being a servant in response to their argument about who was the greatest. How did they come into that argument about who was the greatest?
It was kind of like that one where at the table you don't go and put yourself by the host in case you get moved or someone.
It really did this meal called back to so many of our previous meals, didn't it? Including his teaching, don't choose the place of honor. Don't go seeking the place of honor. Yeah, that really did come up, right? Why did they start arguing about who is the greatest? You're allowed to look back. It's not cheating.
He mentioned who was worst.
Okay, he mentioned who was worst. Okay, that's a great way to look at it, right? So Jesus said, he gave the elements, the bread and the cup, and do this in remembrance of me. And then he went straight in to his prediction of betrayal. Right? We didn't get the name Judas. It wasn't emphasized. And yet this idea that one of you who's at the table with me is going to betray me said, well, there's a worst among us. And if there's a worst among us, then maybe that's not me. And maybe I'm better than you. And maybe I'm better than him. And maybe I'm the greatest. And isn't that our human nature, right? To fold right into justifying ourselves, to comparing ourselves to others. And that's how Jesus begins to teach them The life in the kingdom is not like that, right? I am among you as one who serves. And what was Jesus' great service? To sacrifice, to be the new Passover lamb, to lay down his life for as a ransom for many. And so who else is going to be called on to suffer and sacrifice? The disciples, the apostles there now, and Jesus' disciples, everyone who follows him even now, right? This is our call. Yeah. What else?
I'm starting to learn when you repeat somebody's name 2 times. You look at something special.
Okay. His Simon.
Martha, Martha.
Yes, yeah, that repetition of the name is key. It's only a few times in scripture. I think we said 7 total. Coincidence? Interesting. 7. So that we saw that in the Martha story, and here we have Simon. Satan has asked to sift all of you all my disciples, as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon. Okay, yeah. What else?
He establishes the new covenant.
Okay, the new covenant in to remember him, the new covenant in my blood. Yeah, we saw how this was a final supper. It was a culmination of his ministry. It called back to all of those suppers before. It concluded everything that the prophets had promised. It concluded Jesus's work. And in that way, it was a finishing of what went before. But in another way, he also inaugurated the Lord's Supper, the communion, the Eucharist, right? And so it's a looking forward. And so this meal is kind of a hinge that finishes what came before and begins the new covenant that comes after. We compared those covenants and we talked about how the lifeblood was an element of both the old covenant and the new, and Jesus is the new Passover lamb.
And when we said that he desired to eat the Passover, it's his last chance to teach.
Yeah, he desired to eat the Passover. I think he probably loved just being with his friends, but he also, he loved teaching because he does it every chance he gets, right? And we talked about how he begins the reveal. And so we're moving into more of the reveal today, and that will be key to today's lesson. All right, anything else from last week that struck you? Lula, Carrie, anyone?
We said there were 4 verbs that he used.
Okay, in the meal.
He took bread,
Took?
gave thanks, he broke, and he gave.
Okay, took, blessed, broke, gave, right? Those 4 verbs. We're on the lookout for those today. All right, very good. Let's begin by reading our passage, the first part of it, Luke 24, 1 through 12. And Carrie has agreed to read that for us. She is online. She's going to unmute. She's working on it.
Okay,
Yes,
can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the 3rd day be raised again." Then they remembered his words. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others with them who told this to the apostles. But they did not believe the women because their words seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves, and he went away, wondering to himself what had happened.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, let's go back to verse 1. Who is they on the first day of the week, very in the morning? Yours says, okay. The NIV says the women, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay. In my translation I was using, it just says they to study, which is more literal, but the NIV is filling in for you, because this passage, it just says they, but look above. What have we been talking about? Right, the women who had come from Galilee, come with Jesus from Galilee. So these are these same women. Remember, we talked about it, listed like this is who's traveling with him: the apostles and these women who are supporting him out of their own means. Go ahead.
So is it the names that we have over here?
There's some overlap and some, but in both cases it says and others, right? So we know there's a group with some overlap in it. Yeah. So these women when we get their names, what do you want to tell us their names?
Mary Magdalene.
Mary Magdalene.
Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the others.
Okay, Joanna, it's literally Mary of James. We don't know if she's the mother of James, the wife of James, the sister of James, she's Mary of James. Mary, the one, James's Mary. Sometimes we do that when we're telling someone and we think they know who we mean, James's Mary. But because there is a Mary, mother of Joses and James in another passage, mother is considered most likely, and mother is used here. Okay. So they rest on the Sabbath, and then in verse 1, what are they intending to do? Put the spices on the body. What is putting spices on the body? What does that mean? What's that about?
It's just a burial preparation.
This is mortician's work. Okay, this is burial. This is the way that we treat the body for burial, and so they are doing that. They've prepared to do this mortician's job, right? Are the women expecting a resurrection? That's not. You don't bring spices for a resurrected body, right? So let's continue to notice that. Are these people expecting a resurrection as we go through today's passage, right? They arrive, and the stone, which should have been sealing the tomb, is rolled away. And that's covered very quickly in Luke's gospel. But what's remarkable about the stone being rolled away?
It's probably huge.
Heavy, yes, big.
Protected and guarded
And
by soldiers.
okay, in Matthew, we're told that this is guarded. Luke doesn't mention that, but Matthew goes into substantial detail about the way this guard came about and what they did later and how they handled not doing their guard jobs, all of that. So yeah. So they get there and they enter, and what do they find? Okay. We see they don't mention the burial clothing here, do they? But we hear about it with Peter, so we think it was there. What do they not find? A body, right? Okay. Now, we would use the word body for a corpse. I just did it like 5 times, and I was like, every time it gave me a little I'm going to talk about that. We would say body for a dead body, but this is not, in Greek, this is not a word they would use for a dead body, right? We have language that we change when someone has died, right? We say, even immediately after someone has died, we would say, she loved quilt. We change the way we talk because now the person is dead. Well, Greek changes the word they use for body. This is the word soma. This is the word for a living body. We know this word. Anyone think of where you've heard soma? Somatic, exactly. All these medical terms, chromosome, somatic, psychosomatic, all of these with soma or soma in them, these are terms that come from the Greek for a living body, right? Also, there's a brand of bras and underwear called Soma. It's body wear, right? It is intimates. They go directly on your body.
So every time it says body in this area.
Every time it's Soma. So why would Luke use the word for Soma, a living body, if these women are not expecting, they're looking for a corpse? They're not expecting resurrection. Why does Luke use the word for a living body?
Because Jesus has told them he would rise on the day after.
Okay, and do the women remember that yet?
No.
Not yet, but who does? The angels. We as the reader remember that, don't we? Does anyone remember what it's called? It's a literary term. When we, the reader, know something and we're watching the show or reading the story and the characters in the story do not know it. I have my English teacher shaking her head. Past tense. So a past tense, we're talking about something that is written in our, she has, no, she had. That's our past tense. This is not a trick, but a device that a writer uses.
All I can think of is foreshadowing.
Okay, foreshadowing is probably happening here, but it's a different term. This is dramatic irony.
Dramatic irony.
Yes, thank you. So the classic example of dramatic irony is when Romeo thinks Juliet is dead, so he's going to kill himself. But what does the reader or the audience of the play know? We know she's alive. It's so affecting to be the audience who knows what is happening and the characters don't know. And that's what Luke is doing here. They're looking for there is no living person. There is no soma body, right? And so Luke is bringing in this idea, this dramatic irony. We know things that the characters don't. And this runs throughout these two passages today. Okay.
What about the fact that Luke wrote this after all this happened, so he knows that there was no dead body, and so he's
Yes.
thinking ahead? Or
He is writing it from the perspective of a follower of Jesus, the risen Lord, right? And the reader, he's writing it for readers who are followers of the risen Lord. Exactly. So he's writing it for, just as that's why we get those little asides that say, but the apostles didn't understand any of this at this time. Like they didn't know, but we know that they will know, and we as the readers know. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so why is Luke making a point that the characters in the story don't know that Jesus is resurrected, that they aren't expecting a living body?
He's trying to show that they didn't really believe everything he was teaching them.
Okay, they didn't believe it, right? And that is going to be a main point of this passage, right? They are not there yet. Why else does that matter? Why does it matter that they don't know yet that there's supposed to be a resurrection?
This quote from the angel is interesting.
Okay.
Why do you look for the living among the dead? And they're probably like, no, we came here looking for someone who was dead.
We came here looking for someone who's dead.
You know,
It's a heightening of that very effect, right? What would an ancient person want to know about the resurrection? If you as an ancient person were deciding, is this resurrection thing for real? What would you want to know?
Where is the body?
Where's the body? What happened to it? Okay. And what are some theories? What could have happened to it?
Somebody took it away.
Okay, Matthew even tells us, let's tell them the apostles stole it. So this idea that maybe the resurrection was a hoax perpetrated by the apostles is in circulation in ancient times, just as it is today, right? Don't people sometimes believe, yeah, they said there was no body, but somebody hid it and then they claimed he was resurrected, and you know, the fact that we never had a body doesn't really tell us anything because the apostles probably hid it. So Luke is making a point to say Jesus's closest followers, they weren't even expecting a resurrection. They didn't yet understand. And so this is important apologetically, right? For someone to believe ancient people had different ways of looking at the world, but they still wanted the same kinds of valuable testimony to believe something that we want now, right? And that is an important role of the Gospels, is to provide that testimony. And so he's telling us they didn't expect this at all. They weren't thinking resurrection and can we make it look like a resurrection. They weren't even thinking resurrection at all. Okay. So how do the women react in verse 4?
Perplexed and terrified. Terrified.
Yeah, they're terrified, right? They're perplexed. This is sometimes translated as at a loss. They don't know what to do. There's no body. And so then what happens?
It's almost like these two men are reprimanding them. Don't you remember what he said?
Don't you remember? Okay, so these two men in clothes that gleam like lightning appear. What are these men? Angels, right? This is classic description for heavenly being, right? Radiant clothing and the terrified response of anyone who sees them, right? This is what happens with angels, right? So, and then the disciples on the road to Emmaus later refer to them as angels in verse 23. Okay, so we're supposed to understand that these are angels from this description. Mark only reports one, but Luke reports two. Why two? Why would he be intent to include that detail that there were two? Two makes witnesses, right? And that idea of two comes back over and over through today's passages, with these two passages, and the idea of two appears in both of them, right? Okay, what's their message? They're not living. You don't look for the living among the dead. Why? He is risen. There is the good news. He is risen. And then the sort of rebuke, maybe, which is what?
He spoke to you and he said it could happen.
He told you all of this. Were you listening? He told you all of it.
It's amazing that they know that he told them.
Okay.
That message, even the angels knew what he was teaching. That's remarkable.
Jesus didn't say it just once, did he? So Jesus's prediction of his passion and his resurrection is understood through the spiritual world and through the testimony. That prediction shows up in all the Gospels, right?
So God's plan was revealed to the heavenly hosts.
God's plan
As it
was revealed ahead of time. Jesus said it, but somehow they didn't understand it. And then what? Verse 8.
They remembered.
They remembered his words, right?
I sometimes wonder if God kept that from their understanding until the time was right, so that it could really be impacted upon them.
Linda says, I sometimes wonder if God kept that from their understanding until the time was right. And we do see Jesus keeping his messiahship a secret. Don't tell anyone. We see it being made clear through these earlier passages that none of the apostles understood early on, right? Until we're going to get to the big reveal today. Yeah.
I was just thinking, it's not logical, and when they're hearing this, remember with Mary, when Lazarus died, and Mary and Jesus, he's going to be resurrected. He said, well, I know on the last day, I know on the last day it'll happen. So they may have been thinking, yeah, he'll be eventually resurrected. But our logic, human beings, we just don't expect that unexpected thing.
Yeah. And I think, he says all that the prophets have spoken, but the prophets were kind of subtle in some ways, right? Right. Some of that is, you really have to dig for some of that. We'll talk about that. Cryptic maybe is better than subtle. Yeah. So the women remember his words, and then they what?
They go and tell it. They go back, it says they go back to the seven.
Then they go back.
And then they go and tell everything.
They tell everything to the 11 and all the others, right? So the apostles and all the disciples who are with them. Do you think they understood the resurrection at this point? You don't think so? I had always read this as not thinking so, but in this lesson, in trying to read it with fresh eyes, I feel like the statement, they remembered his words, is very much parallel to their eyes were opened in the next story. What if these women, and every single gospel tells the first people to the tomb, the first people to hear the good news that he is risen are these women, right? These women are the first messengers, and they're told, go tell it. And what are they going to go tell if they don't get anything, if they don't understand anything, right? So now I'm thinking, maybe we need to rethink this. Maybe these women are the first to understand the truth about Jesus and his resurrection. But, and we're speculating some there, it could go either way. How did the 11 and the others react? Idle talk you have? What else? What other translation do you have? Nonsense. It says, literally this is, in their sight, it was silly talk, nonsense. Yeah, in their sight, it was silly nonsense. Idle tales, okay. It's literally a word that means just that, silly talk. So, and it was silly talk in their sight, and they disbelieved. This is a word for no faith. Pisteo is the word for faith, and then it's apisteo, like anti, right? They disbelieved. So it's nonsense in the eyes of the disciples. What does Peter do? He goes and looks. Why do you suppose he goes?
He wants to see for himself.
Yeah, he wants to see. What else? What might Peter be feeling there?
I thought about that because you had that question. That he had just denied Jesus right before his death, so he may have had some like, well, I don't want to do that again. I don't want to make that mistake again. I'm not being the disciple that I know I should be. I don't know.
Yeah. I think his regret is probably playing into that. His love for Jesus is probably playing in. He may be beginning to have hope, and it feels dangerous to hope, right? And so he wants to prove or disprove it, and so he goes to the tomb and he sees. Go ahead.
He was pretty courageous because they were all hiding basically, and he said, there's soldiers at that tomb. I'm going to go to the tomb, and I think he showed a huge amount of courage to even make that step.
What a great point. Pam says he showed a huge amount of courage. Matthew tells us there were soldiers that had been there, that there was a known that it was a guard posted there, and they were kind of in hiding, right? This was why Jesus said, no, I don't know him, because it was like, I better stay under the radar, right? We're all in danger here, right? That's how he ended up denying Jesus in the first place. And so he goes, there's some courage there, and some, it seems like maybe desire to undo, if he can, the mistakes that he has made,
Mine
right?
says he's still wondering in himself what was to come to pass.
Wondering or marveling. Yeah, it's a word for marveling. And it's what people do when they first hear Jesus preach. When they hear his authority, they marvel. And that's the word for what Peter does here. He marvels at what he's seeing.
The other thing about Peter, as we've all known, he's always so rash. Just acts, he acts before he thinks, you know.
Okay.
So that's a little bit.
We see his personality coming out here, like, well, I'll just run to the tomb, right? And then John runs and beats him in the foot race, right? But doesn't go in. Peter, he barges right in, right? So we get all these bits and pieces from our different gospels, yeah. All right, so this is the first part, the first half of our story, but because we have not yet seen Jesus, right? We've seen the angels, we've heard the news, but in Luke, he has not yet revealed the face of Jesus on this resurrection, right? And so in some ways, this part is an introduction for the next part, right? Someone read 24:13 through 35. It's a long passage, so loudly, please.
Now that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the 3rd day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." Want me to continue?
Yes.
He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together, and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the 2 told what had happened on the way, and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread.
Thank you. Okay, so going back to verse 13, who are we talking about now?
Who discipled us?
Okay, 2 disciples. It says 2 of them. Who is them?
Those gathered.
Those gathered that heard what? Those gathered when?
That morning when the women told about the resurrection.
When the women told about the resurrection. So 2 of the group that had heard the testimony of the women, okay? And why 2?
Witnesses.
Witnesses, yeah, I think that theme is coming through, right? So again, this passage is connected to the previous passage. Haven't we seen that so many times in this series that every time we think like, oh, we've changed to a new subject, and then there's some way that these are tied together so that there's really a thread that continues to speak to us over and over again, okay? And what are they doing, these two disciples? Walking and talking, right? They're traveling. So it's a journey. Jesus just spent the entire center of the book of Luke, right? From mid chapter 9 all the way through chapter 18, going where? To Jerusalem. Where are they going? From Jerusalem, right? They are going away from Jerusalem. What is the meaning of, if we had to assign a symbolic meaning to that, what would we say?
Showing them spreading the word.
Are they spreading the word?
They're starting to.
Do they know any word?
They're disappointed. They think that he wasn't really the Messiah.
Okay, I think we are going to get a sense of spreading the word in some of those journeys later, right? And maybe there's an irony here because we get something so different now. So I think that's a great point. Because they're so dejected, this is them giving up on the word, right?
Why they're so sad.
Right, he asked them why. Yeah, you can tell that they are discouraged. They are dejected, right? They've given up on the mission. The thing that Jesus just spent 9 chapters traveling to Jerusalem for, they're like, it failed. We're going home. We're going away.
They're walking 7 miles. That's a long time to talk, to rehash everything. Maybe even debating back and forth about what it meant,
What is
what
this?
we heard, what do you remember that he said. It's a lot of time to reflect.
A lot of time, and they probably need it because think about their feeling, they're rehashing the betrayal, right? The betrayal by one of their own, the betrayal by their leadership. They mentioned that our leadership did this, right? So the anger of their leadership, their own response, the sadness, the tragedy of it all. And so this is the rehash. This is the friend conversation, or possibly the husband and wife conversation that you need to deal with such a difficult, terrible event, right? And so they have this long walk. Now, this village, yours says 7 miles. It's literally 60 stadia, which is a different, which is about 7 miles. Historians can't find a town named Emmaus that is 60 stadia away from Jerusalem, but Josephus mentions a city called Emmaus that's 30 stadia away from Jerusalem. So we wonder, was that an oversight, or was Luke doing something when he says 60 miles or 60 stadia? What would that be? If it's really only 30 stadia away, 60 is round trip, right? So is he doing the same thing that he did with the body, where he's referring to the round trip distance? Because we know, we've heard this story. I heard those disciples turn back and walk the entire way back the same night. Did you hear that too? So this story has circulated, it may be that 60 stadia is what Luke is using to tell us that they made that entire 7-mile round trip. By the time, it's still the first day of the week.
I just told Jesus that he should come and stay with them because it's getting dark.
Okay, it's getting dark, and they go, yes, right? Night's almost here, right? Great point. Okay, so Luke is giving us this story, and then he tells us who came alongside on their journey. Luke tells us, right? But what about the 2 disciples, verse 16? They don't know. Their eyes were held from recognizing him. Okay. So one main question that pervades this whole passage is, why don't they know Jesus? Okay, so let's think about that as we go on. And Jesus asked them, what are they discussing? And what's their reaction?
Well, you're the only person that know what's happening.
Don't you know? Have you been under a rock? Don't you watch the news? Right? Like this, they're like, that's crazy. How can you not know what's happening? And what do they tell him? What's been happening? They pack a lot into a short statement, don't they? What's been happening?
So that the prophet that was mighty and all deed was there, and the chief priests and the rulers delivered him to be killed, and it happened.
Okay, so Jesus of Nazareth was, right? Are they expecting a resurrection? No. He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. Is this sounding conversational? Is this kind of the way you talk to your traveling companion?
Confrontational.
Conversational? I feel like my spidey senses for Old Testament allusion are tingling, right? Like I feel like, whoa, I think we have Old Testament allusion coming up. Who would they be talking about? A prophet, powerful in word and deed and before God and all the people.
Well, they're still surprised. That
Okay,
he
maybe
doesn't know-
Moses. They're still
that
surprised.
he doesn't know what's going on.
Right. They're trying to tell him. But, when Stephen described Moses in his final sermon, his speech before the Sanhedrin, before they stoned him, he says, this is Acts 7:22, he says, Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in word and deed, right? So this is kind of the way that we describe these famous prophets. Maybe someone would have described Elijah this way too, but these are ways of describing those men of power who brought the word of God, and they're describing Jesus that way. And so they're saying, we thought he was the prophet like Moses, the Elijah come back, the one God promised to send. These are their messianic hopes. But had their messianic hopes come true? No, they say no. We had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel.
They didn't call him Jesus Christ. They called him Jesus of Nazareth.
They didn't call him Jesus the Christ. They did not.
And mine says they trusted it.
They trusted it, but it failed them. Yeah, there's so much sorrow in that, isn't it? Yeah, he's back to Jesus of Nazareth. He's not the Lord Jesus. He's not the son of David. He's just Jesus of Nazareth. Great point. Okay. And then they say, and some of our women. What do they tell about the women?
They astonished them with these tales.
Yeah, with these, it's just a strange tale, right? They did, and did the disciples believe the two women? You can tell they were there, right? These are two, they say, we heard it from the women, but they disbelieved. They did not believe. So that fact is shaping everything they tell about what's been going on, right? That is the perspective from which everything is told. And how does Jesus respond in verse 25? Okay, foolish and slow of heart, right? What is that? Is that a commendation? What is it? It's a rebuke, right? Do you think these disciples deserved a rebuke?
Now, is it possible, though Jesus was fully human and fully divine, he still didn't understand human nature? I don't know.
I think he recognized disbelief when he saw it.
Yeah.
Maybe? Yeah. It's hard because we can tell these disciples they're grieving, right? They're hurting. But should they be grieving?
Not if they really believe.
Did they have information? What did the angel say? He is risen. He's living. He's not among the dead. He's alive. And so should they be grieving? I don't think this is a super harsh rebuke on Jesus's part, right? He calls them slow of heart or sluggish of heart. Have you ever felt sluggish of heart? Right? That feels familiar, doesn't it? I have been sluggish of heart. Yeah.
I love that it says, beginning with Moses and all the prophets who interpreted to them in all the scriptures, the things, and when I'm taking this class about social justice class, but everything there points to them. Everything else, what you know, he tells you everything about it.
Okay, he told you everything about it. Okay, so does Jesus end with the rebuke? No, he goes on, right? He says, you had the testimony of the women, right? Does Jesus think the testimony of the women should have been valuable, believable? I think so. I mean, this is who the angels choose to tell. All four gospels report that the women are the first to get the news, and they're told, go tell the disciples, or they do go tell the disciples in all except Mark, where they're frightened, and then we learn, that they have told later. But it seems that the testimony that God has chosen to provide, these people are refusing to believe. And so a rebuke is appropriate, but even though we go like, oh, but they're hurting. They are, but this rebuke is leading them to the next part. Jesus doesn't end with the rebuke. What does he do instead? He explains. He teaches, right? We are not surprised because Jesus teaches at every opportunity, doesn't he? Everything that is presented before him is an opportunity for teaching, and he goes straight into teaching, right? He said, the prophets said that the Christ, Messiah, the anointed one, must what? Two things. Suffer and suffer these things and enter his glory, right? Not just suffer in general, suffer these things. The prophet said it would be like this, right? And what is Jesus's glory?
Seated at the right hand of God.
Okay, so we are looking forward to the ascension as we have been since chapter 9, right? He's headed towards his taking up, enter his glory. The word glory always means the shining revelation of the truth about God, right? So Jesus is going to he's going to suffer, but he is going to reveal the truth about God. Our God is a God who suffers. Our God is a God who has a victory over sin and death. Our God is a God who will be seated at the right hand of the Father, reigning, bringing the kingdom of God slowly but surely, right? And so this idea, Jesus presents it. And then beginning with whom? Moses. Okay, he says beginning with Moses. What does that mean? What's he talking about when he says with Moses?
From the beginning. History of the Israelites.
Okay. Chris, I missed that. What'd you say?
The books of Moses.
Okay, so the books of Moses are the Torah. This begins the history of creation and all the way to the creation of Israel and to the giving of the law, right? Torah means instruction. Oh, I wrote too big. I don't have room for my whole table. Well, I'm not going to erase it. So this is Genesis through what? Deuteronomy, the first 5 books. I hope I spelled that right. Okay, so he's beginning with Moses, and then what's next? Okay, the prophets. All right. What are the prophets? What does that mean? The prophets.
All of Isaiah, Ezekiel.
Okay, all of them, Isaiah, Ezekiel. Okay, so in the Hebrew scriptures, The way it is organized is there's the Torah. There's 3 sections. There's the Torah, and then there's a section called the Nevi'im. I've got this, you don't have to copy it all down. It's all in the study page. And those online can see it on the study page because I know it's not very visible here. Nevi'im, this means prophets. Okay, and this consists of the former prophets and the latter prophets. Latter starts with Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and ends with Hosea through Malachi. It's what we would call the prophets. We call these major prophets. A lot of times we include Daniel. Daniel's not included in this part in the Hebrew scriptures. Hosea through Malachi, what we call the minor prophets. They're minor in length, not importance, but yeah, all of these are what they call the latter prophets. Any guesses as what the former prophets might be?
Is David part of that?
David is part of that.
Solomon?
Solomon, yes. All of that history, we all remember this when we did all of that history. Remember how we went from Joshua, Judges, all of the first and second Kings. All of that is the history of Israel told from the perspective of the prophets. And so these are considered the former prophets. This is Joshua through Kings, these books. Those are in the section called the prophets in the Hebrew scriptures, even though they're in our history section. They're in the prophets. Now, there is another section of the scriptures, and that is called the writings. Or sometimes it'll just be called, it'll be referred to as Psalms. This is called the Ketuvim. Because I know y'all are going to remember these words, right? I have to look them up every time. That's okay. It's all right. But this has Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the wisdom literature. It has Ruth, Esther, and it ends in Chronicles. Chronicles is the last books in the Hebrew ordering of the scriptures, right? So when Jesus says the law and the prophets, what is he saying? The past, the scripture. This would be a typical way, even though he only says these 2 this time, but I want you to look out for a different opportunity. You'll have to wait a week, but where he says all 3. But this is a way of referring to the scriptures. So basically, he said what we would call the Old Testament, the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures. He says, beginning with the beginning of the scriptures and going through all of the other rest of the scriptures, he told them what? What were they about? According to him, what are the Hebrew scriptures about? Jesus. Since when is the Old Testament about Jesus? Okay, so this is a paradigm shift, a mindset shift for them as much as it is for us, right? Because we very often think the Old Testament is the part of the Bible that is not about Jesus, right? It's all the part that came before Jesus, but Jesus says it was always about me, right? This is what he teaches, is that the Old Testament scriptures are about him. And he explains how. Now, don't you wish you had a record of this explanation? Me too. I really, really, really do. But we kind of do. Where might we find references to Old Testament scriptures that explain how they're about Jesus? In the rest of the New Testament, right? Hebrews tells about that. Where else tells about that? Acts. Where in Acts? Some of Paul's sermons, he's referring to the Old Testament, isn't he?
He goes through the whole history there several times, and it's all, lays all of it.
He lays all of it out. Who else lays it all out? Peter in the sermon at Pentecost, right? Who else? One more that I've thought of. There's probably more than one more. Stephen. Yeah, he tells the whole history of the Old Testament in reference to Jesus. What happens when Philip finds an Ethiopian eunuch along the road? He says, you're reading Isaiah 53, that's about Jesus. And he explains how. And so Luke really does lay a lot of this out for us. I went ahead and included, just so, you know, Isaiah 53, this is the suffering servant passage that Philip addresses in Acts 8, right? These passages from Joel and Psalm 16 and Psalm 110, Jesus preaches out of Psalm 110 about himself as well. Happen in Acts 2. There's, you know, Jesus says the sign of Jonah will be given to this people. So there's something, you know, the fact that Jonah is buried for 3 days and then taken, you know, in the dark and brought back to life. That is something Jesus teaches in Luke 11. Paul preaches in his sermon, Stephen in Acts 7. And so we don't have it laid out here. Like I really kind of wish, I just want it all in Jesus's words, please. But what we have is that the results of Jesus's teaching here then suffuse the understanding of all of the disciples and therefore the church going forward, so that we can glean the same understanding by reading their sermons and their writings, right? It comes out because now it's at the heart of their understanding of who Jesus is, right?
Yeah, I just had a thought too.
Go ahead.
This is before the Pentecost in the Holy Spirit. And so, you know, we're kind of hard on them, you know, for not understanding and believing, but they didn't have that, you know, spirit with them.
Well, they had Jesus.
So they did.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I don't think I would have understood. I'm not at all surprised that they don't understand. And I think the writers of the Gospels are fairly compassionate with them that they don't understand yet. And in some ways it wasn't time yet, right?
It's almost like they're going through the Bible exam.
Okay,
This is the review.
Well, is it, so there's maybe a final exam, but also if we think about this, like the murder mystery, this is the part where we begin to see what's really been going on all along. This is the reveal. This is the behind the, yeah. And how do you think these two disciples, Cleopas and his friend or wife or whoever it is, how are they feeling? They tell us later. Should have been overwhelmed, right? How did they phrase it?
Were our hearts burning within us?
Were not our hearts burning within us? Boy, isn't that poetic? That really speaks to me. Yeah, what does that mean? Why were their hearts burning within them?
They're understanding, or they're getting it?
They're getting it, right? Things they've known their whole lives, passages they've known their whole lives are taking on a completely new meaning. You know, it's like sometimes, you know, Mitch does this really well, where we're studying something and he goes, now look, let me compare this with Jesus. And he starts breaking it down piece by piece. And you go, oh, I never saw that. That's so good. That's so exciting. Well, they had that times, however, you know, all of this, right, multiplied so many times because these passages and ideas have been coming together. They needed that walk back to Jerusalem to rehash it in the other direction, didn't they? Right? So it's no wonder that they're like, no, don't travel on. Do what? Stay with us, right? They urged him strongly, stay with us. Same verb, to stay somewhere, to be an overnight guest, to abide, as Jesus used with Zacchaeus, right? They had to have thought, he must stay with us. It is necessary that this person stay with us, right? And so, of course, when you stay with someone, that includes a meal, right? And who is the host of their meal? Right? It would be them, right? Normally, it's them. It's their house. It's either their house or their familiar place that they're allowed to stay in some way. And yet Jesus becomes the host of the meal, right? And what key words? Took,
Blessed it, broke it, and gave it.
blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them, right? What day of the week is it? It's still the first day of the week, isn't it? What meal is this? What would we call this meal if it's the first day of the week and he took it and he blessed it and he broke it? It's the Lord's Supper. It's the communion. It's the Eucharist, right? Here is the risen Jesus hosting the Lord's Supper on this Sunday morning for the very first time. And what happens? Their eyes are opened. Okay? This is the communion meal. This is the meal of knowing Jesus. So let's return to that question we left hanging. Why couldn't they recognize Jesus before? It wasn't time. What else? I think it wasn't time. That's true. What else?
They needed to go over all that God had done. They needed to understand God.
They did not understand who Jesus was. They didn't know him because they didn't have the faith to know him. They disbelieved. When they were told he is risen, they didn't believe. They chose not to believe, right? They did not have the faith. The blind man said, Jesus, son of David. But here, they were spiritually blind until Jesus taught them enough to open their eyes and they could know Jesus, right?
But then he vanished.
Okay, then he vanished. Where did he go? We'll find out next week. Okay. They vanished. They didn't, so they had known before who they thought Jesus was. They had known who they assumed him to be, maybe who they wanted to be, but they did not know the true Jesus, right? They have been transformed from faithless and disbelieving to faithful and witnesses. Now they're going to go back and tell the apostles. They're going to witness. They're going to testify, right? Now they're going toward Jerusalem. Now they're going toward the good news. Janelle.
The 16th verse says, but God kept them from recognizing him.
Yeah, God kept them from recognizing, but why?
They needed to learn, they needed to be taught.
They needed the reveal, and they needed to increase their faith, right? They needed to correct their understanding of who they thought Jesus was by listening to actually Jesus, right? And don't we feel that way so much, right? So, I love all this Old Testament stuff. I'm super keen on all of this, but there are other ways that we assume we know who Jesus is and what he is doing, who we thought he was, how he must probably just be on our side. He must think like me. He must, all of that, it so easily comes into our approach to Jesus. And if our approach to Jesus is self-serving, do we really know him? Right? We need to have our eyes open by listening to Jesus, right? We have so much testimony of Jesus right here in the Word. Right, we have to know who he really is to be his faithful witnesses, to go towards the mission, to testify, to believe as we should. Okay, comments?
Verse 13. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus. All right? compare that with verse 33. They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. I feel that return trip only took them half as long.
I think they were excited. Yeah, yeah. They were dejected upon leaving, but they are not just full of hope. They're full of new mission when they return.
Good news.
Good news. The good news propelled them right on back to Jerusalem. Other comments or questions? Yes, that awakening of who Jesus really is. Yeah. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been great. I appreciate all the discussion as usual. Oh, one more.
I have a question back on the women. Do you think they were not believed because they were women, or it was such a tale that they were telling?
Y'all. Do you think they were not believed because they were women?
Yes.
Me too. I do too. I don't, you
No, I
know.
just said it was such as they were saying.
It's these women and their silly talk.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think they were dismissed partly because they were women, right? And so, you know, we have that sense of God valuing their testimony more than the people around them valued their testimony. That didn't stop God from using them.
Right.
He didn't say, well, I won't use them because nobody will believe them. He still used them. What's that?
It didn't stop them either.
It didn't stop them. And then we get the proliferation of the appearances, and so everything begins to come together. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. I have our schedule for the next 3 weeks on the board, and I will turn it over to Pam for announcements.
Do we have pictures?
During the announcements.
Yes.
No. Yes.
Did you want to stop the recording?
Do we have any particular announcements that?
Is this where you wanted pictures?